Somewhere in southeastern Turkey sits a hill that, by all logic, shouldn't exist 1,500 years ago, before the wheel, before writing. Before a single brick had gone up in Sumer or Egypt, someone raised a ring of massive carved stone pillars on top of that hill, then deliberately buried the entire structure. For decades, the central question was simple: who built it? But that's no longer the real mystery. The real mystery is this: scientists have since dug into the genetic record buried in that region, and what they found doesn't just point toward who raised Göbekli Tepe. It quietly reshapes our understanding of where every farmer, every city, and perhaps every organized religion in human history actually originated, and almost no one outside a tight circle of geneticists has fully pieced it together. Here's where things get strange before they get clear. If you're picturing a straightforward case, dig up bones, run the DNA, get an answer. That's not what happened. The people who actually cut, hauled, and raised those pillars have never had their genomes sequenced. Not once, not completely. No DNA testing has ever been performed on remains recovered from the site itself, and even those remains aren't believed to belong to the builders. So if you've heard a headline claiming DNA revealed the builder's identity, the truth is stranger than that. Researchers couldn't just read a skeleton's genetic code like a label. Instead, the answer had to be pieced together sideways through soil, through ancient wheat fields, through the bones of people who lived nearby and were related to the builders, and eventually through populations that replaced entire gene pools an ocean away. That's the real story, and it stretches far beyond one hillside in Turkey. Let's rewind, because the context matters. Gobekli Tepe was found during a University of Chicago survey in 1963 with its megaliths dated to roughly 9600 to 8700 BC. To put that in perspective, this predates Stonehenge and the pyramids by thousands of years and predates the very first domesticated crop by just as long. Yet here was coordinated labor, symbolic carving, and architectural ambition on a monumental scale. That single fact upended a long-standing assumption in archaeology that monumental building was something settled farming societies did. Once they had surplus grain, social hierarchy, and organized religion, hunter-gatherers weren't supposed to have the coordination or motive to move stones this massive for something so symbolic. But there it was, half buried in a hillside, undeniable. Before this discovery, nobody thought hunter-gatherers built megaliths at all. That's not a minor footnote. It rewrites the assumed sequence of civilization. And it raises a sharper question. If people without agriculture, without permanent settlements, without writing, could pull off something this ambitious, what else were they capable of, and what happened to them afterward? Most retellings stop here. This is actually where the real story starts. What bone fragments were recovered from the site were mostly broken pieces of skulls, some deliberately carved with grooves and drilled holes interpreted as possible, evidence of a skull-related ritual practice tied to honoring ancestors, memorial display, or something more unsettling involving captives. But here's the detail that changes everything. There was never enough usable genetic material in these fragments to reconstruct an actual genome, and there's no confirmation they even belong to the community that built the site. In short, the very people who raised these stones left behind almost no direct genetic footprint at the place where they worked. So where did the real answer come from? This is where the investigation widens dramatically. Scientists shifted their focus from bones to plants. Geneticist Manfred Huhn and his team used DNA fingerprinting to trace every strain of domesticated einkorn wheat on the planet back to wild populations growing on Karakata, a volcanic mountain range only about 30 kilometers from Gobekli Tepe. Not a broad region, a specific mountain close enough that the builders may have passed those wild grain fields on their way to the temple. That's not a coincidence, easily brushed aside the genetic birthplace of one of humanity's. Foundational crops sits almost next door to the birthplace of monumental ritual architecture. Later work extended this tracing emmer and hard wheat to the same broader stretch of southeastern Turkey, now referred to by researchers as the cradle of agriculture, since the wild ancestors of at least 8 founding Neolithic crops overlap in that same corridor. The people building Gobekli Tepe were living right at the genetic epicenter of humanity's coming transformation in its relationship with food. And a species that changes how it eats changes everything downstream of that. But wheat was only the opening chapter. The heavier genetic evidence comes from the humans who lived across this region during and after the site was active. 97 genome-wide samples from Neolithic sites in central and northwest, Anatolia cluster tightly together, dominated by a maternal haplogroup K, followed by N, T, H, V, and H, all tracing to a broader Near Eastern gene pool. This was a scattered population. It was a cohesive genetic community, sharing the same valleys and volcanic foothills as the people simultaneously raising carved stone temples nearby. And this population is now widely recognized as the primary genetic source for Europe's earliest farmers. This is where genetics settled something archaeology alone couldn't. Were these early farmers outside migrants who brought agriculture in with them? Or were they direct descendants of the hunter-gatherers who'd always lived there, possibly the very people who built Gobekli Tepe, transforming their own way of life from within a landmark ancient genome, from a late Pleistocene individual in central Anatolia, pointed toward local continuity, rather than a wave of outside settlers suggesting the shift into farming didn't require foreign newcomers to explain it? That matters enormously. The people who built the earliest temples, and the people who later domesticated the first crops in that same region, might not be two separate groups who happened to cross paths. They could be one continuous lineage watching their own world transform beneath them. Think about what that implies. This wasn't a story of outsiders invading the region. It was a population that stayed rooted in place long enough to build something monumental with no agriculture at all, and then, within a relatively short span of centuries, began domesticating the very crops growing in their backyard. The temple came before the farms. That sequence alone should give anyone pause because it flips the usual narrative on its head. We're taught that farming produces surplus, surplus produces religion, and religion produces monuments. But what if shared ritual at a site like Gobekli Tepe is actually what drew scattered groups into close, sustained contact, making agriculture an almost inevitable byproduct of people simply staying together? From here, the story stops being local and becomes global because these Anatolian genomes didn't stay in Anatolia. Ancient DNA shows that between roughly 6,500 and 4,000 BCE descendants of these Anatolian farmers spread across Europe along two main routes, one through Thrace and the Balkans into Central Europe, the other along the Mediterranean coast. As they mixed with local hunter-gatherers, they replaced somewhere between 70 and 100% of indigenous ancestry across most regions. Lineages that had existed on European soil for tens of thousands of years were pushed to the margins. Within a handful of generations, not through any single recorded war, there was no writing yet to record one, but gradually, field by field, valley by valley, there's another layer. Most retellings leave out language. Geneticists obviously can't sequence spoken words, but linguists have long debated whether an expansion like this one carried entire language families along with it. When a population replaces 70 to 100% of a region's ancestry, it's hard to imagine the original language surviving intact for long, either. Some researchers argue that the deepest roots of certain European and Near Eastern language families trace back to exactly this kind of Neolithic expansion, spreading alongside the same wheat and the same ancestral DNA now documented in the record. The theory is still debated, but given the scale of what's already been confirmed genetically, it's hard to dismiss outright. And this thread runs all the way to some of the modern world's most iconic monuments. Genomic studies of Neolithic remains in Britain show that the ancestors of the people who eventually built Stonehenge traveled west across the Mediterranean before reaching Britain. That means the lineage tied to the world's oldest known megalithic site in Turkey, and the lineage tied to one of the most famous megalithic monuments on Earth may be two chapters of the same expanding population separated by thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, but connected by an unbroken thread running through the wheat fields of Çatalhöyük. Perez, the part worth stating plainly, because it's the piece most retellings miss. Nobody has sequenced the DNA of the specific individuals who carved the vultures and scorpions into Göbekli Tepe's pillars. That direct personal answer still doesn't exist. But the DNA of the surrounding population tells a story that may be more significant than any single genome could. It tells us that the world's oldest known megalithic religious site sits precisely at the genetic and agricultural origin point of an expansion that would go on to reshape the ancestry of an entire continent. There's a darker undercurrent here, too. If this expansion displaced most of Europe's hunter-gatherer ancestry, what became of the people pushed aside in certain wetland-rich pockets of northwest Europe, hunter-gatherer ancestry persisted far longer than elsewhere, in some cases nearly 3,000 years longer into the Bell Beaker period. Apparently because women from Anatolian-descended farming communities joined existing hunter-gatherer groups there rather than the reverse pattern seen almost everywhere else. Even the exceptions to this sweeping replacement carry their own story of negotiation and survival. One researchers are only beginning to reconstruct. And here's where the uncertainty creeps back in, because every answer this research provides opens up two more questions. If the builders of Gobekli Tepe and the earliest Anatolian farmers are as closely related as the continuity evidence suggests. What actually triggered the shift from raising ritual pillars to planting fields was farming a slow, almost accidental outcome of centuries spent gathering in one place for ceremony, or a deliberate strategy pursued by people who'd already proven they could organize labor on a massive scale for something as impractical on the surface as a stone temple. There's no confirmed answer. And without DNA from the carved skulls themselves, researchers can't even say for certain whether they represent the community's own honored dead or outsiders brought into the ritual space through violence. It would be satisfying to say scientists have definitively identified who built Gobekli Tepe through DNA. That version sounds tidy, but the honest version is messier and more compelling. That direct evidence, the actual bones of the people who did the work, still refuses to give up its secrets. Instead, the answer had to be pieced together indirectly from wild wheat growing on a nearby volcano, from the genomes of neighboring communities living centuries later, and from the DNA of people scattered across an entire continent thousands of years removed from the original site. The full picture didn't come from a single grave. It emerged from an entire landscape of genetic clues left behind by a civilization that never wrote a single word about itself. There's also the question of what remains undiscovered. Geophysical surveys at Gobekli Tepe have already detected at least 16 additional stone circles still buried. And unexcavated, meaning what's been uncovered so far might only be a fraction of what's actually there. Every future digging season carries the chance of finally recovering remains intact enough to sequence a genome directly linked to the builders themselves. Until that happens, every conclusion about who they were remains an inference, a remarkably well-supported one, but an inference nonetheless. So where does that leave us? A hill in Turkey, older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than writing, sitting at the genetic crossroads of one of the most consequential population expansions in human history. Wild wheat from a nearby mountain became the ancestor of bread eaten around the world today. The people who may have shared blood with the builders went on to reshape the genetic makeup of an entire continent, eventually raising other stone monuments thousands of kilometers away in landscapes their ancestors could never have pictured. And yet the specific people who once stood beneath those carved pillars, who chose to bury the temple deliberately rather than let it fall apart on its own, remain genetically silent, somewhere beneath 16 unexcavated circles, still waiting in the ground. What were they trying to protect by burying it? What did they fear would be lost if it stayed exposed? And if their direct descendants really did go on to reshape the ancestry of an entire continent? Does that mean the deepest roots of Europe's genetic story don't begin in a river valley farm or a Bronze Age city, but in the quiet, deliberate act of raising stone pillars for reasons we still can't fully name? The wheat has answered. The neighboring villages have answered. The distant descendants scattered across a continent have answered. The builders themselves have not spoken yet. And until the ground beneath those 16 buried circles finally gives up its secret that silence may be the most important clue of all,